Welcome everyone to Snippit Sports Science Podcast, episode 35, proudly brought to you by eliteform.com. And today I have a guest author, first author Craig Pickering. Welcome aboard.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I know Craig from actually Bath days when he was a 100-metre sprinter. I worked with Bath Rugby at the time and remember them working with the very famous Malcolm Arnold, the coach, and he had quite a really good squad there. Finished my time at Bath and left and came back to Australia and randomly, I think I received an email from you and then found out you got into research. It'd be pretty cool just to hear your story about that transition from summer to a winter sport and then that transition then from out of sport into research.
Yeah, so like you said, I used to be a professional athlete, so it's quite good. I was a 100-metre runner. I went to 4 World Championships and 1 Olympic Games, and I got a World Championship medal in the 4x1 relay and a European indoor silver medal at the 60 metres. And so when I was an athlete, I was also, when I was at Bath, I was at university there doing sport and exercise science. And the reason I did sports science was because sort of maybe 4 or 5 years before that, I did GCSE PE. It's kind of like the qualification you get in the UK aged 14 to 16. I remember getting a textbook on the first day of that class. I was probably 14 years old, just started my athletics career. I remember being fascinated that you could sort of understand the human body in this way. And even then I sort of thought, well, if I can understand it better than people that I'm competing against, that will enable me to have better training or better nutrition habits. That was the first time where I thought I fell in love with sports science on that first day. And I went home and read the textbook that first weekend, which then was what eventually got me to Bath to do sport and exercise science as an athlete. And then in 2012, I had a back operation. So I herniated a couple of discs in my back quite badly. I had half of one completely removed, which meant that I sort of had 8 or 9 months without running, which is obviously a problem because the 2012 Olympics were in that 9-month period. So I couldn't run, which meant I couldn't compete at the Olympics, which is especially gutting because it was the home Olympic Games. And so I spent 7 years preparing for Olympic Games in your own backyard and then know for 4 months beforehand that you can't compete at it. In the UK, we're quite fortunate in that we get paid to do sport by the government. And that's good if you're performing because they'll keep paying you. But if you're injured and you can't perform, they'll stop paying you. Which is what happened to me after that surgery. So at that point, at the end of 2012, I wasn't getting any support from the government anymore. Couldn't get a job, or certainly couldn't get a full-time job because I was training full-time for 2 sessions a day, a common problem for most athletes. So I kind of had to find somebody to give me money to continue to do sport, which is where British Bobsleigh came in. So they said, oh, we'll give you some money to see how good you are. Come on for a trial day. So I went on to their trial day. I broke all their push testing records in that first session. So they were pretty pleased. And then 3 weeks after that, I was competing in the World Championships, which is a strong transition from not doing the sport at all to competing in the World Championships. And then a year later, I was selected for the Winter Olympics, which made me the 8th British athlete to be picked for Summer and Winter Olympic Games. Now, that sounds like a happy ending, but it isn't, because when I went to the Winter Olympics, I injured my back again, which ended up being a career-ending injury, so I had to retire. 3 different doctors told me that it's probably about time to call it a day. At that point, I was 27, had no work experience. I'd left university 5 years prior and done no further education. So I was fortunate to get a job at a company called DNAFit. The only reason I got that job, I think, was because one of my friends was a founding member of it. And he wanted somebody to come in and help him on kind of sports science things. And that was part-time. And then I got really into that, sort of like rekindled some sort of deep-seated love of reading scientific papers in me as I was teaching myself all these effects, all the different genes. And so eventually I decided to go into a doctorate sort of in that area, trying to understand how genetics impacts sports performance. And that's not entirely unselfish, because the motivation behind that was kind of when I was an athlete, I always thought, why, if I do the same training as other people, do they get better and I don't? And why do I do different types of training? And then I guess some of the papers I'm going to talk about now are to do with caffeine. And I kind of experimented heavily with caffeine in my athletics career, and I figured out that I could only handle very low doses of caffeine. So, for example, I might be taking 5 milligrams per kilo of caffeine pre-training and having a terrible training session, whereas my training partners are doing the same caffeine strategy and having great training sessions. And then immediately after that training session, I go to a lecture at university and learned that 9 milligrams per kilo of caffeine was the amount that you needed. And I remember thinking, there's no way I can tolerate. But that kind of, was in my head for a long time. And I guess that's where my interest in understanding why there's variation in the response to caffeine came out of.
And just for the listeners, what was your best 100-metre time?
So my best legal 100-metre time is 10.14 seconds. I ran a very slightly wind assisted. It was 2.1 wind, 10.08 seconds.
Oh, that's a killer. Yeah. That's so close. Yeah. So for those who don't know, anything over 2.0 is an illegal wind. And it could be just unlucky, a bit of a gust of wind at the time of the reading. And in terms of the training, you went from a sprinter to a bobsledder. Much difference there? Not
really. It's the better parts of sprint training magnified, really. So obviously when you're a 100-metre runner, there's different aspects of the race. So you've got acceleration, maximal velocity, and speed endurance. And the nice bits of that training are acceleration and maximal velocity. And the not nice bit is speed endurance. And when you push a bobsleigh, you have to run for sort of 45, 50, 60 metres. So speed endurance just isn't a factor. Also, you just cut out all the longer distance, which for me was being 150 metres. So not long by other people's definition. So that was nice. And then I was able to put on, I sort of raced around 84, 85 kilos in athletics. And in bobsleigh, they want you to be much heavier. So I got to 96 kilos there, which again was, you don't have to monitor your weight quite as much. You can put on muscle. You got an excuse to do bodybuilding training. So just like 25-year-old guy's dream, which is just to do sprints and lift heavy weights all day, every day. And DNAFit, what are they all about? Yeah, so they're a genetic testing company aimed at improving people's health and fitness. I'm head of sports science there. I'm not a founding member. I don't have any shares in there. So the better the company does, I don't necessarily do any better. Sure. But it is a conflict of interest, obviously, people need to be aware of. But yeah, so we're a genetic testing company, give people advice on what their genes mean for what type of training they should do, how likely they are to get certain types of injuries, which then they can do training to offset that. And then the diet side, looking at things like weight loss, how you get insufficient nutrients to support your own unique makeup, things like that, essentially. And is that through saliva? Yes, like a saliva test, yeah. Actually, it's a cheek swab test. So you use like a large cotton swab inside of your cheek. You just rub the cotton swab around your cheek for about 60 seconds, just collects all the dead skin cells, and then you send that off to the lab that we've got. From that, you just get some really good training direction. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So, I mean, genetic testing companies get a hard rap from various different people online. Some of it's warranted. There's good genetic testing companies and bad genetic testing companies, and I like to think that we're a better one. We've got peer-reviewed research underpinning the utility of our products, which I guess is better. That's what you can ask for, really, because it's been subjected to external review. So yeah, I'm pretty confident that what we do is much better than a lot of the other companies out there. That's fascinating. So you've actually got a couple of papers out there, and I know also that you blog quite heavily for Hammer Media, and you do some really good posts, not only on caffeine, but also other performance-enhancing aspects, which are really interesting. I enjoy that. I know the Twitter sphere enjoys it as well. So today we're going to go through a couple of caffeine papers. Did you want to just talk about these in general, how you came into writing these papers, and just go through them for the listeners? Yeah, sure. So like I sort of alluded to, I used caffeine heavily during my sporting career, and I noticed that there was variation in how much caffeine people could take. I seem to be able to take less than other people to get the effects. And so when I got the opportunity to write papers, I was interested in getting a better understanding of why that variation exists. And I thought it'd be pretty useful as well, because everybody knows caffeine is performance enhancing. Right? There's so much research out there. Doing more research to show that caffeine is performance enhancing, I don't see the point in that necessarily, because we know it's performance enhancing. What I want to sort of do is try and pick away at some unresolved questions around caffeine. So the first paper I wrote was about inter-individual variation in caffeine and how much it improves performance. So how ergogenic is it? I looked at all the different factors that I could find, which mean that some people can tolerate caffeine better than other people, and how that would impact performance. So I cut that down to kind of three sections, essentially. There's a genetic component, an environmental component, which basically is a catch-all for everything that's not genetic. And the third one is epigenetics, which is the interaction between your environment and genetics. On the genetic side, there was two genes which I found had an impact on how caffeine might affect your performance. So one of those is called CYP1A2. So that produces an enzyme which metabolizes caffeine, and different people will have a different version of this gene, which means that they produce more or less the enzyme, which means that they metabolize caffeine quicker or slower. And for some reason, it appears that people that metabolize caffeine quicker, they get a larger performance-enhancing effect when they take caffeine before exercise. And we don't really know why that is. There's a couple of theories around why it might be, but it's poorly understood. And then there's a paper that came out just earlier this year by Nancy Guest, who's a Canadian researcher, and she showed that people with a certain version of this gene, the slow metabolizers, if they take 4 milligrams per kilo of caffeine, which is a fairly normal dose of caffeine, their performance is worse than if they take no caffeine at all. So in those people, caffeine is not performance enhancing at all, it's actually performance worsening. It's called ergolytic. So that's one gene which has a big impact and has been fairly well studied in terms of its effects on sport. The second gene is ADORA-A2A, which is a adenosine receptor. So it changes the shape of the adenosine receptor slightly. And how caffeine works, or one of the ways caffeine works to improve performance, is that it stops adenosine from binding to the adenosine receptor, so caffeine binds to it instead. So you've got a slightly different shape of the adenosine receptor that will alter how well caffeine binds to it. There's only been one paper which has looked at that in terms of performance. And again, they found that people with a certain version of this gene, they had a greater performance enhancing effect if they took caffeine than other people. But this gene's also been quite well studied, not brilliantly well studied, but quite well studied in terms of anxiety and sleep disturbances as well. Obviously, there are two things which are important when it comes to using caffeine in athletes. So people with a certain version of this gene, if they take caffeine, they're much more likely to be anxious. So that plays into your thinking now when you're using caffeine. Say in this Olympic Games, for example, biggest competition of your career, are you going to take the same dose of caffeine that you normally take, given that you know you're going to be more anxious than normal, and you know you've got a version of this gene, which means that this caffeine you're going to take is going to heighten your anxiety. You need to know that so that you can prepare better for that. Similarly, if it affects your sleep negatively, if you've got heats and semi-final Olympic Games, say day one, and the final on day two, you need to be thinking, if I take caffeine from a semi-final at 8 p.m, how is that going to affect my sleep for the next day? If you need caffeine to get through the race, then obviously you need to have caffeine because you've got to qualify for the final. Or you're Usain Bolt or another world-class athlete, you then perhaps want to think about modifying your caffeine dose a little bit so it doesn't negatively affect your sleep. You sleep really well, then you can perform a little bit better the next day. So that's kind of an overview of the main genes that's been shown to impact how much caffeine improves your performance. Then there's a couple of other factors as well. Surprisingly, how much cruciferous vegetables you eat, in theory, has an impact on how well you tolerate caffeine. So the more broccoli you eat, the more the CYP1A2 enzyme you produce, the quicker you metabolize caffeine. So that could have an impact on that. Things like your sex and your training status, potentially, some studies say they do, some studies say they don't, impact how much caffeine improves your performance. Things like body mass too, as well. And then also like how often you regularly use caffeine will impact that as well. They're kind of the main things really, which all those factors help explain why if I take caffeine, I have a different response to you. So that's half the battle. Now we know what causes it. The next thing is kind of like, how can we use that information? And that's much harder. So you could make a case for getting genetically tested and understand those two genes, but those two genes, whilst they clearly have an effect, there's going to be other genes that we don't know have an effect. And genetic testing is not going to tell you that. Similarly, like your life experiences in how often you've taken caffeine before, things like that are all going to play into that. So it's a really complex. In the conclusion to that paper, I basically say you can't take any general advice about caffeine really. You have to start off with the general advice and then experiment. So I would say the general advice is have 3 milligrams per kilo of body weight of caffeine 60 minutes before exercise. So that'd be a decent start point. And then take more caffeine, see how you feel. Take less caffeine, see how you feel. Take caffeine further away from exercise, so 9 minutes before. Take it close to exercise, so 30 minutes before. It's just an ongoing process. It probably should happen anyway with athletes because they constantly refine what they do. Certainly, I refined my caffeine strategy over sort of 6 years of trial and error until I got to a point where I was pretty happy with it. And that's kind of what in the paper myself and my co-author, John Kiley, suggested, which is that pick a start point, work up and work down and experiment around it.
In terms of when you talk about training, and some of the athletes I work with, they'll take it for the gym. High jumper, for example, she took it before she went to the gym, had one of the best gym sessions in the world. And then I therefore suggested potentially trial it during training, although she didn't listen and she did it before competition. And it was just a totally different reaction. And she actually it was like unbridled energy she just couldn't control. And that's, I guess, another thing where you might have, it's still exercise, but something which is simple, like lifting weights or running, versus something with a high skill component that might be your actual technical event.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So typically like your gross motor skills, so lifting heavy weights, running really quickly, they're going to respond, or they should in theory respond really well to caffeine, as will any event which has a pain component. So endurance running, for example, that responds well to caffeine. Your fine motor skill, if you have large caffeine doses, can degrade. So obviously, the highly skilled events is not going to be a great thing to do, particularly if you haven't tried it before. And then we've got to remember that anxiety will certainly have the potential to heighten some of those negative effects of caffeine. So a dose that you take pre-training might not be the right dose that you would have before exercise, particularly if you're prone to anxiety or overstimulation, especially before competitions. And that will also change with the level of competition as well. So Olympic Games, you've got a very different stimulation than at just a general open meet at your local track. And so they would require different levels of caffeine as well. And so I sort of have a nagging concern in the back of my mind that this starts to overcomplicate things somewhat, which is why the trial and error approach is great, because the athlete is in charge of the decision-making process. They can see how they feel. It just gives them, they're not sort of looking for experts or gurus online, of which I'm not, to try and tell them exactly what to do. They're figuring out for themselves. And that's definitely the best approach.
Also, when I have conversations to certain athletes, I say, "Oh, do you do caffeine?" And they say, "Yeah, I have a cup of coffee." And so you're not talking about a cup of coffee. You're talking about an actual, like a no-dose or something to that.
Yeah, so difficult, really, because caffeine is caffeine. And so in theory, it shouldn't really matter where it comes from. Now, coffee is obviously a fairly impractical way to get your caffeine, especially around competition, because you have to transport the coffee to the side competition, and then it's hot. So then you've got thermoregulatory control issues as well. So I used to take caffeine through Red Bull, the energy drink, because I couldn't take tablets. They seemed to just, for some reason, mess with me even more. Now, a bigger issue is the dose of caffeine in the delivery mechanism of which you're taking it. Yeah, so there's Ben Desborough, who's a researcher just down the road at Griffith University. He showed that if you went to a cafe and bought an espresso, and then went to the cafe next door and bought an espresso, they'd have different amounts of caffeine in there. So it's really hard for you to quantify how much caffeine you're getting from a cup of coffee. And then if you go to the same cafe on different days, buy the same drink, that'll have different amounts of caffeine in as well. So even if you think you're getting a standard amount of caffeine from your coffee, you're probably not. And just maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, you published some research showing the same effect in pre-workout supplements. So the amount of caffeine they say there's on the label is not always in the actual powder. And the amount of caffeine they say on the label, if you buy 3 or 4 tubs of the same brand, same type of pre-workout, there'll be different amounts of caffeine in each of those tubs and each of those scoops. Best way probably to get caffeine, that the dose that you're getting, is via tablets, but there'll be variability in that as well. So basically, whenever you take caffeine, you're just guessing how much caffeine you take, and you want to shorten that error value as much as possible by ideally using the same caffeine source, although there is variation in that. That's probably the safest way to do that. So build up a routine. How I used to do it, like I said, it was just energy drinks. Around training, coffee is probably fine because it's training. Coffee is can be a social event for people. People might like it anyway, so it's all those factors in it as well. Around competition, I probably wouldn't be using coffee, especially because its effects on gastrointestinal distress, which when you're nervous will be obviously heightened further by caffeine. So yeah, other more portable methods, energy drinks or tablets, are probably preferable, and tablets are the most transportable.
Yeah, that's for sure. Can you elaborate anything around the debate of leading into a competition, whether you should decrease your caffeine intake or keep it the same and just up it, or is there a school of thought around that?
Yeah, there are 2 schools of thought around that, depending on who it's to. One says, yes, you should do that. One says, no, you shouldn't do that. This is what I touched on in the second paper that I published, which is, should we withdraw from caffeine before exercise or before competition? So the reason people suggest you do it is because it would, caffeine's a drug. So like any drug, the more you take it, the greater your tolerance to it. So a short-term caffeine withdrawal, in theory, would make you more sensitive to the effects of caffeine. It doesn't appear to happen. And there's negative side effects to not having caffeine when you're used to it as well, like headaches, nausea, agitation. They're things you don't want to happen before competition. The research kind of doesn't indicate any performance-enhancing effects of short-term caffeine withdrawal prior to competition, and there's some potentially negative effects from it. So in my opinion, I don't think you need to do it. I don't think you should plow on as per normal.
Yeah. And you're saying this then led into the second paper. So you've done the background behind caffeine use and then talking about the habitual use of caffeine. Is that just the progression of the papers?
Yeah, so I think it was a bit of kind of when I was an athlete, I got so much often conflicting advice from the different nutritionists and people that you'd work with on what the best thing to do regarding caffeine was. And so I thought, well, we probably need some sort of paper to explore this, because there are some bits of research, but actually surprisingly few. I can only find, I think, 4 or 5 studies on caffeine habituation and 3 on caffeine withdrawal. So it's not well studied at all. So yeah, I just want to kind of question or try and bring around a consensus on what the underlying effects of caffeine habituation are, because historically we've sort of thought about caffeine for athletes as a pre-workout and a pre-competition thing. But athletes don't just use caffeine in those situations. Athletes are normal people who drink coffee, who drink things like Coca-Cola, things like that all have caffeine in there. So they're getting exposed to caffeine outside of their performance domain, really. And that's often not considered. So we just think, okay, you're an athlete, take caffeine at this point. But what about the afternoon when they go and have coffee with their mates, or in the evening when they have a soft drink? So just kind of wanted to sort of what happens in the real world with athletes a little bit more. Should athletes do this? And if they do, what impact does that have when they use caffeine again? So actually it turns out that we don't know whether regular caffeine use reduces its performance enhancing effects. In theory, it probably does. But it appears that you can limit that by just taking more caffeine. So, for example, if you regularly take 2 milligrams per kilo of caffeine per day, spaced throughout the day through coffee, soft drinks, etc., on a competition day, you would take 4 milligrams per kilo, so you would double the dose, and you'd have no negative effect of habituation there. That's my understanding of the research. That's my hypothesis.
In terms of, you talk about 2 milligrams, 4 milligrams, typically what's in a shot of coffee? How much are you looking at there?
So again, that completely depends, but we're probably looking at about 60 milligrams of caffeine in an espresso, more or less. It can be as low as 40, could be as high as 80, like the brew time, things that all play into it. I think Red Bull is 35 milligrams of caffeine per 100 millilitres. So a 250 milliliter can of Red Bull is about 80 milligrams. And then if you get caffeinated gels, often they're about 50 milligrams. Things like the large 500 milliliter cans of energy drinks, they're often highest, so 150 to 200 milligrams of caffeine. Most pre-workouts now will be 200 milligrams of caffeine. So there's a lot of caffeine out there. You've got to look at the label and the label will give you a guide of how much caffeine is in there. But yeah, so if you're an 80 kilo male shooting for 3 milligrams per kilo of caffeine pre-competition, that's 240 milligrams of caffeine, which is 3 cans of Red Bull. Yeah. So that 3 cans of Red Bull is obviously 750 milliliters of liquid. That's a lot of liquid.
Yeah, that's right.
Why tablets then potentially a better way, or actually, because I couldn't tolerate tablets, I used caffeinated energy bars, caffeinated energy gels, and they were a good way for me to get caffeine. So there's a variety of different things out there that you can, it's just got to find the caffeine source that works for you, which is ideally wouldn't be a ton of liquid, and then experiment with it.
And is there other concerns that people should be aware of in some of the energy drinks? There's caffeine in it, but there's obviously sugar. So some people might be sugar sensitive and other chemicals, so to speak, that people need to be aware of, right? So rather than going out and getting a can of mother, they might need to be wary of what else is in the can, how that may affect their performance.
Yeah, definitely. So like you say, energy drinks don't just have caffeine in there. They've got loads of other things in there as well. And there's, in the UK now, you can't buy caffeinated energy drinks in a supermarket if you're under the age of 16, so they'll age check you. So they've brought in new legislation around that. If you take an energy drink, you can get a no sugar version of that, which obviously cuts out some of that, but it's obviously got loads of chemicals in there. I guess that's your own personal philosophy on whether that's good or bad or neutral. I took a lot of energy drinks during my career, and I think I'm doing okay now. But conversely, then, if you're looking at weight loss and things like that, or weight management, having loads of energy drinks with sugar in there is not gonna be great. So I guess pre-competition, take what you need to take to get yourself in the condition to compete well. If you're for your regular caffeine stuff, maybe a pre-workout powder or maybe even coffee, if it's just before a weight training session, something like that, is probably a fairly decent way to get that. I think it's more important to have some caffeine than sort of really concern yourself about all the different other things around it.
Yeah, and in terms of power, strength, speed, athletes versus endurance-based athletes? Is there any differences that people should be wary of?
Yeah, caffeine definitely works for endurance athletes. And for an endurance athlete, the longer your event goes on, the larger the effect of caffeine. Or at least some studies have shown that. So endurance athletes certainly should take caffeine, and they can take that late on in their event as well. And actually low doses, 1 milligram per kilo, have a performance enhancing effect in endurance athletes. For speed endurance, so a speed endurance training session, that should respond well to caffeine, as would a general strength training session where there's an endurance component of that. Even if it's a strength session, you're doing 4 or 5 sets or 4 or 5 reps, fatigue's going to creep in there. Caffeine will offset that. For one-off explosive power, one-off sprints, it's fairly equivocal, to be honest. Some studies say it has an effect, some studies it has no effect. But we've got to remember that caffeine also has an effect on your brain. So your mood will be enhanced, which means you might be able to have better training sessions. If you haven't slept very well, or just general fatigue, which has come in through training, caffeine will offset that. All those kind of factors play into it. So whilst caffeine might not have measurable impact on 1RM or 60-meter sprint time, it probably will make you feel better. So you'll feel like you get an impact. And placebo, very powerful thing. So take what you can get and harness that.
Yeah, definitely. With all your own use, and you would have seen a lot in your own time in different sports and all the studies, are there any misconceptions out there in the public that when you read something or you hear something, you go, well, that's just not true?
I suppose with caffeine, there's always in terms of general health, there's always the coffee is good for you versus coffee is bad for you. So if you read a newspaper, 1 week it will be 2 or 3 cups of coffee a day, increase your chance of heart attack. The next week it'll be 2 or 3 cups of coffee a day, reduce your chance of heart attack. And obviously one of the main constituents of coffee, not the only one, but one of the main ones is caffeine. So people often think that caffeine can be bad for you. The most recent research kind of indicates that caffeine probably isn't bad for you. And in fact, the study that I'm thinking of showed that the more caffeine you consume on a daily basis, the lower your chance of dying from various different diseases. So we probably all should have some sort of caffeine in our daily basis, unless there's some sort of underlying medical condition like a heart defect, stuff like that, or anxiety. And so that's probably the main one, which is that often people think caffeine/coffee is bad for you. And I believe in California, Starbucks has to put a warning on its coffee cups saying that caffeine and coffee can cause cancer. With that, it's not really the case. So that's probably the biggest misconception. And then, I guess the withdrawal thing in terms of performance, a lot of people think you need to withdraw from caffeine prior to competition, and evidence just doesn't really support that.
Sure. I was really fascinated the bit about broccoli. So you increase broccoli, you could potentially increase the effect of caffeine.
Yeah, well, yeah. So what broccoli does is it causes you to produce more CYP1A2. That's the enzyme which metabolizes caffeine. So we know people that metabolize caffeine quicker appear to get a performance-enhancing effect from caffeine, a much greater performance-enhancing effect. So in theory, eating broccoli should heighten that effect. But I haven't seen that tested. But also smoking increases your CYP1A2. So in theory, smoking would increase the performance-enhancing effect you get from caffeine. And I probably wouldn't recommend that for most people.
No. Well, that may cause cancer, apparently. So I should actually say that will cause cancer. That's great. Just in closing, it's a really good covering of caffeine and the research you've done. Is there any other bits of information in there that you want to share?
No, so I think it's from the 2 research papers, they're the main take-homes. I've got a 3rd research paper on caffeine, which is under review now at a journal, which is kind of 2014. There's a really, really important caffeine researcher called Lawrence Spreet, and he published a review article, so obviously went to literature, looked at all the articles, and he concluded that low doses of caffeine, which he defined as less than 3 milligrams per kilo, were performance enhancing. And he's right, they are performance enhancing. But my question is that dose of caffeine as performance enhancing as a more typical dose, which is between 3 and 6 milligrams per kilo of caffeine? And actually, that's not been well studied. On the papers that suggest that low doses of caffeine improve performance, they don't compare to a higher dose of caffeine. And if you're an athlete, that's an important thing to consider, because what you want when you take caffeine is to get the maximum performance improvement, not just a performance.
That's improvement.
Right. So although we might think that we know everything about caffeine, we actually don't. There's a lot more things to kind of come out to it, especially around like the finer points of how we're going to utilize it. So I'm certainly interested in exploring things like that more in the future.
That's great. And one thing we didn't establish, this is part of your thesis as well?
Yeah, so my thesis is on whether we can use genetic information in elite sport, and if we do, like how useful would it be? So the caffeine paper on habituation, that won't be my thesis. I just wrote that for fun. Same for the low dose and high dose one. But the first one, the one into individual variation, that would be in there. Yeah, my thesis is kind of like the first half is trying to understand, in theory, how could we use genetic information in elite sports. I've got a research paper published on hamstring injuries and genetics, for example. And it'll be looking at things like that. The second half will be more empirical studies. So I've got 3 papers under review on that as well, showing some pretty interesting results of if you give people genetic information, can that predict how much they improve with exercise? And one of my studies suggests that it can. And then conversely, can you use genetic information to predict or identify elite athletes before they are elite? And my results suggest that you can't. So 2 sort of hopefully pretty important takeaways.
Yeah, definitely. It's some good food for thought there. It just made me think about sometimes do you improve because you've got the program and you're committed to stick to it and you believe that it's going to work because it's tailored to you. That's pretty powerful. Yeah,
so certainly that's one aspect of it. In my studies, the athletes were blinded, so they didn't know their results. So they didn't know if they were going to respond well or not well. The training program is hard control for that. But yeah, in dietary research, we often see that people that get given personalised information, I'm saying that in kind of like inverted speech marks, they stick to their diet much longer, so adherence is better. So the same may well be true for exercise, but we don't know.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I look forward to reading those. That's where we'll leave today's podcast. It's been really insightful to hear your story around caffeine and get some insight into the research that's out there, because I think, as we say, we get bombarded with so much information, and it's actually nice to talk to someone who's an expert in this field, who's doing a lot of work and a lot of research. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And as I mentioned earlier, you're quite prolific on Twitter and you write some fantastic blogs. Social media, where can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, best place is on Twitter, like I said. So my social media handle on that is @Craig100M. So 100 meters. That's the best place to find me.
And what we'll do is when we put out our own social media posts at Snippit Sports Science, we'll obviously be putting Craig's details and just the abstracts behind the papers as well. So if you want a little bit more information, you can go to our website there. And 6 months to go on your thesis at the moment?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So hoping to sort of finish that early to mid next year.
Good luck with that one.
Yeah, thanks.
And thank you, listeners, for coming on the podcast today. If you want more information, please go to our website at Snippit Sports Science and also our social media at Snippet Science. And thanks to our sponsor, eliteform.com. Thanks for listening.